always said if I quit computer science, I would become a yoga instructor. So here we go. Let's see if I'll make it. All right, everyone, reach up really high. Get up on your tippy toes. And then drop your arms. I know there's chairs and stuff. You could try bending down. Maybe not. All right, one more time. Stretch up, stretch up, stretch up. I love it. Who's having a great whist so far? Yes, yes, a big round of applause for all the organizers. I can't tell you how much work it takes to put this thing together, and it's all volunteer. So thank you all to the organizers. A big hand of applause. All right, Alex is here. Should we start?
We can. We shall.
All right, let's do it. Alex.
Okay, yeah, thank you everyone. Welcome to UIST Visions. I'm Alex Olwal.
And I am Mira Doncheva.
And yeah, this is a special program. I think it's in its 7th year. It's a special venue for forward-thinking ideas where we want to really embrace the opportunity for the UIST community to have a position as thought leaders in technical HCI. And this is a juried program, so we have a set of proposals that we review in a juried process, select up to 2 talks, so we have 2 great talks today. And it's a big distinction in terms of it's not so much about reporting on existing research that folks have done, but more about new research directions, novel, provocative ideas, ideas for where the community should go, and problems that we may not be working on, but should be thinking about. Mira and I will be around throughout the conference, so please come to us if you have ideas for submission for the next year. We want to talk about things that may or may not fit. We'll be happy to chat with you.
All right. So today you'll hear from 2 amazing presenters, Arvind Satyanarayan and Wendy Mackay. And each of them will talk for about 20 minutes, and then afterwards we're all going to have a chance to ask questions. And so get your questions ready, and we'll have an open discussion afterwards. And so thank you all for coming, and welcome Arvind. We'll start with Arvind.
All right. Thank you very much, Mira and Alex, for the introductions. I'm really excited to be here today. I'm really excited for the way the Visions program is organized this year. I'm looking forward to the sort of like Q&A panel style with Wendy. I'm really excited to share with you all a set of ideas that I've been working on for the past year in collaboration with my colleague Graham Jones, who is in the anthropology program at MIT. And in many ways, I see this talk as sort of continuing the conversation from last year's UIST Visions. And in particular, you might recall, this really great white paper that Mary Morris and her team at Google DeepMind published, where they proposed, measuring progress towards AGI in terms of this leveled matrix approach, right? So measuring the competence that various AI models exhibit at either a narrow range of tasks or a broad range of tasks. And these levels are essentially analogizing that model performance to humans. So from being comparable to an unskilled human all the way through to virtuosic AI that performs at the 99th percentile of most adults. And then the final level, superhuman performance where it's outperforming 100% of all people. And in many ways, I think these levels are really valuable and interesting and in some sense an evolution of the approach that Alan Turing proposed at the dawn of this field, right, with his imitation game. And roughly speaking, the way that the imitation game was supposed to work is that Turing imagined a setup where a human evaluator would read the transcript of a conversation between a computer and another person. And the evaluator's goal was to determine which participant was the human and which participant was the computer. And the idea here is if the evaluator could not tell those two apart, the machine is said to have successfully passed the Turing test. And I would argue that we're essentially still continuing to operate in the 75-year-old paradigm for the most part, right? And in this golden age of AI, this new golden age of AI, it's maybe worth reevaluating whether the Turing test is still the paradigm we want to continue operating in. What does it offer us and what does it not? So I would argue that the Turing test, continues to measure how competently AI can mimic human behavior, right? What it doesn't really help us understand is whether the AI-driven systems that all of us are developing, whether those systems are actually empowering people or perhaps inadvertently disempowering people, right? And I imagine this second set of issues around empowerment and agency and autonomy, that's really why many of us, I suspect, got into HCI, right? And so surprisingly, maybe, in a recent CHI 2023 paper, Daniel Bennett and colleagues found that agency and autonomy still remain pretty ambiguously defined in the HCI literature, with both terms being used to describe a whole wide range of phenomena. And the issue with this ambiguity is that it makes it really difficult to discuss the sort of real substance of our work, right? What are the tensions and the trade-offs and the design decisions that we're making as we sort of pursue, increased user agency and autonomy? And I particularly like this term, umbrella concepts, because as they quote, these umbrella concepts challenge our ability to accumulate and communicate knowledge as a field, right? In this case, around issues like agency and autonomy. So what I want to do in this talk is offer just an initial working definition of what we might consider agency to be, right? So here's the definition that I'm drawing on, which comes from linguistic anthropology. I'm going to consider agency to be a capacity to meaningfully act. And by meaningful, I mean the degree to which a particular action advances an agent's goal. So if we just consider, the way that we operate as individual people out in the world, there are two ways that we often assert our agency. The first is that we compose a series of operations in order to produce an action. And then the second is that we interpret the effect that that action has had on the world and how effective that action was in helping us sort of advance our goals. Now, as we shift from operating as sort of isolated individuals to more collaborative relationships with one another, we begin this process of combining and blending our agencies. We establish a common ground, which is that region of overlap that you see in the middle. And the way the common ground functions is it develops a shared understanding of the task and how each person contributes to making progress. And what you'll notice is that the arrows for compose and interpret now point at each other, right? Because we're in communication with one another. And I'm sure that for many of us, as we've developed really long-term, deep collaborations with folks, we've had this experience of almost fusing together, right? Like this mind meld. And the experience here is almost a fully blended sense of agency where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And so the analogical trick I want to play here is I want to use this model of blended agency to imagine the types of agency that we might want to share with automation. And in particular, the type of automation I care about is generative AI. And so, I've probably not yet sold you, right? Like a very natural question to ask is, how different is this really from traditional theories of interaction design, right? The particularly classic one like direct manipulation from some of my academic heroes, Ed Hutchins, Jim Holland, and Don Norman, right? If you squint at it, you might say, well, isn't composition just the gulf of execution, right? This is how a user manipulates a user interface. And isn't interpretation all about the gulf of evaluation or how a user assesses whether they're making progress towards their goal? I think that's a totally reasonable set of questions to have. And for me, the difference I find is in how direct manipulation views what interaction is. From the point of view of direct manipulation, interaction is essentially this closed input-output loop, right? And direct manipulation really views the computer only ever as a tool. And it's the human user that is always the one that has to cross these gulfs. And that typically works fine when the interfaces that we were building, like I said, are relatively closed-ended, right, driven by heuristics and rules that a designer sat down and sort of crafted. But generative AI, however, as we've been seeing, affords much more open-ended interaction loops, right? The output is very contextually dependent. It's very responsive to users, often in ways that are surprising not just to the users, but to the model developers themselves as well. And so for me, what this suggests is a model where the computer or the AI actually functions as a co-agent, where what makes an action meaningful is much more emergent than the sort of traditional models of interaction design that we had before. And in particular, one of the most exciting aspects for me about this model of agency is the boundary between human and AI, something that we call here the line of control. Now, in interpersonal relationships, the roles and responsibilities in collaboration often shift over the course of that relationship, right? And often get negotiated and renegotiated. And so we imagine the same ought to be true with our sort of partnership with AI. And that's why we've depicted that boundary as wiggling, right, back and forth. But that's not just a sort of cute design move that we've pulled in our graphics. And I should say these graphics have been professionally designed by an incredible graphic artist, Sarah Gephardt. And so what I want to do to make this a little bit clearer is zoom into a region of this line of control and map out a taskscape, right? The set of tasks that a human and an AI agent might collaborate around. So we can depict each of these tasks as a loop between the human and the AI, and the steps along this loop essentially indicate different potential configurations of agency that we might choose to design. And as we, all the people in this room, everyone out in industry, user interface designers and developers, as we iteratively prototype and evaluate our designs, we are making decisions about the specific configuration of agency for each of these tasks. And in doing so, what we begin to do is start to stitch together that wobbly, wiggly line of control. But let's just focus on a single task to understand how generative AI might enable some more radical design moves than what we've been able to do so far. And I'm going to pick, my favorite task of all time, which is authoring visualizations. I could, spend tons and tons of times building new systems to do this. And across industry and academia, right, we've developed a whole panoply of different methods for authoring charts, from just basic chart choosers and typologies like the ones we find in Excel and Google Sheets, through to really interesting direct manipulation interfaces, and lots of different programming syntaxes that often trade off expressivity for concision and other characteristics. So I think it's natural to imagine that we would consider all of these authoring approaches to lie in a design space, right, where the dimensions of the design space might be things like interaction modality or level of abstraction. And of course, each of these methods for authoring visualizations affords a different balance of agency. So for lower levels of abstraction, we often choose to design those because they give users more expressive power or more compositional agency. And on the other hand, with higher levels of abstraction, the reason that we often reach for those is because the computer is doing some inference and interpretation on our behalf. And right now, though, what I would consider these design spaces to be are closed, and the reason I choose the word closed is because the only set of people that can explore that design space are user interface designers and developers. And the way they choose to explore those is by, the iterative prototyping that I think many of us are used to. And our goal is to essentially fix the design of a user interface into one or many points. But with generative AI, I think we're able to do something far more exciting and radical, which is to take these design spaces that have otherwise been closed and open them up such that users and AI agents can more dynamically reconfigure the balance of agency as makes sense for them for that task in that moment of time. So, I'm showing you all of this diagrammatically, and it's probably all a little bit theoretic and abstract. So let's make things a little bit more concrete by imagining the ways that I might author visualizations if the design space were opened up to me. Now, I'm going to caveat all of this, right? This is a video prototype. I've not implemented any of this. There's going to be lots of warts on what I'm about to show you. But hopefully, if you squint, you will still, get the essence of what I'm trying to communicate here. So let's imagine that I've imported some data about, population statistics in the year 2000, and I want to begin visualizing it. Now, rather than using any particular visualization library, maybe I just start by typing out bar chart. And after a couple of moments of hesitation, instead of a traditional sort of autocomplete or auto-suggest kind of interface, an AI agent might instead synthesize a really micro interface, right? Allowing me to essentially mix textual and those shelf-based specifications that we saw earlier. Now, after I run the cell, the shelf gets evaluated, and some corresponding textual specification is produced, as well as the visualization. This is a totally reasonable visualization. Bonus points if you can tell what library was used to produce it. But I was maybe expecting a more traditional view of population, right, where you normally have the bars kind of mirrored along the vertical. So let me maybe go in and highlight a part of the specification that I think looks promising. And the AI is, again, going to synthesize a little property inspector here that allows me to dynamically drop levels of abstraction. And my guess would be that I probably need to manipulate something about the stack, and so let me just choose a normalized stack for now and hit save, and whoop, here's the view that gets produced. Not quite what I was looking for. So maybe actually the solution here is to drop even further in abstraction. So I highlight the same encoding operator, maybe with a keyboard modifier pressed, and now my AI agent has sort of re-represented that abstraction, this time now as D3 code with a little bit of maybe program slicing happening on the back end to just highlight, select the parts of the specification that matter. But whoa, like I'm just down a rabbit hole right now, right? Like I'm not going to be sitting here in my Jupyter notebook mucking around with D3 code. And so instead, let me do the second most popular thing when authoring visualizations, which is to go to Google, and type in the kind of chart that I want. And rather than doing the usual thing of looking for code that I can copy and paste and hack at, what I'm going to do is something a bit more direct. I'm going to look at an actual visualization that I care about, take a screenshot of it, go back to my notebook, and paste it into what has only ever been code cells so far. But because I'm operating in a more open design space, I can start to freely mix input modalities together, including, for example, dragging the labels of the header rows of my data frame printout and starting to use them as like annotations on the visualization itself. And you can see that the AI agent, that is fake, is actually sort of reinterpreting it as a data field. And so in this way, I'm essentially blurring the distinction between what input and output is purely as a function of the interaction that I am performing, but critically in the context that I'm performing that interaction. So of course, I probably didn't need to specify all this out, right? Like, I probably don't need to map labels to the same labels on the chart, but I was pretty pleased with my video prototyping skills, so I kept going. But then I could just hit run, and voila, I've got the desired visual idiom, but this time using my backing data. And you might be sitting there going, well, I could build this today, right? Like, why do I need generative AI in all of this? And the key distinction here is that the sorts of interactions that I'm trying to imagine here don't require a designer to have sat down and handcrafted these specific interaction flows, right? Rather, these interaction flows all exist in that open design space, and it is some function of the fact that that design space has been opened that allows the user and the AI to essentially dynamically figure out in that moment in time for this task which of the various interface specification formats, et cetera, make the most sense. And so how do we go about opening up this design space? I think it requires us to sort of start to make a couple of shifts in how we think about what an interface means. So in HCI, I think we've typically thought of interfaces as mediating interactions between people and computers, right? We've essentially, almost exclusively, I would say, designed interfaces to serve the needs of human users. And I'm maybe going to suggest something a little bit heretical, which is that maybe we need to start to think about interfaces as languages for coordinating action between humans and AI, right? So we need to think about the ways in which we design things that AIs can also start to reason about. And what I think this means is thinking about an interface as expressing a conceptual model about a domain or a task that is independent of its textual representation or its GUI implementation or any set of interaction designs. Rather, all of those different interfaces are instantiations of that backing conceptual model. And then that interface language should not only serve human users, but also AI. It should play this role of a shared representation that people and computers can collaborate around. And what I mean by that is both sides of the equation need to be able to reason about the language's syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. And that's just a fancier way of saying that we can now start to distinguish between the structure of our interfaces, the meaning that those interfaces convey, and the context in which the expressions of our interface are existing in. And critically, both sides, as I said, of this interaction can manipulate these properties. Now, one of the concerns that some of us might have is, well, if we're opening up design spaces, right, like are we done, right? Like it's up to now the user and the AI to sort of dynamically figure stuff out. What is the role that the designers play? And on the surface, it might seem that way, but I actually think it's the opposite. I think all our traditional user interface concerns, usability, learnability, discoverability, I don't think any of those are going to go away. And instead, I think we're adding an exciting new set of design questions, some of which might include, when and by how much should design spaces be opened? And a potential way that this might play out, right, is that we as designers might demarcate the boundaries of a design space by defining the semantics, right, the nouns and verbs of a domain or task. And we might even populate the space that we've opened up with lots of candidate syntaxes. And all of these semantics and syntaxes would be available for user AI co-agent to compose and interpret on the fly. And I think for me, one of the long-term goals is much like in interpersonal collaboration and communication, right? If you and your best friend go out, you've probably got a set of, in-jokes, a couple of shorthands, some codes that just make sense to the two of you. What does that mean in the context of our interactions with AI? And so just to wrap up, I want to return to that overall figure of blended agency. I've only ever shown you this 50-50 blend, but what I want to emphasize is what we're suggesting here is not a normative or prescriptive model of agency. We're not saying that this is what it ought to be. Rather, because we're drawing from a very anthropological approach, one of our goals has been to develop a vocabulary about agency that allows us to value different kinds of balances of agency. So even if we were to stick with a 50-50 blend, here are other ways that we might choose to balance agency. And what balance is most preferable is often very culturally situated, right? And I certainly mean that in the societal context. There are different cultures around the world that either prioritize compositional agency or interpretive agency. But I also mean that in the case of research culture. Right? I think in computer science, and particularly at a conference like UIST, I think we often emphasize compositional agency, right? We develop lots of new tools to make it easier for people to express themselves. But what about tools to help people exert their interpretive agency? What do those look like? And the very last thing I'll say is, although there's a lot of complexity and nuance that I think we need to bring to this model of agency, I don't think we're done. I do think we maybe have an initial vocabulary that is interesting to think about how we might empirically measure and even quantify these different configurations of agency. And the reason I think we want to do so is twofold. First, if we develop measures of agency, I think we might be able to figure out how we feel about the progression of agency that I'm showing you here, right? Where the AI's agency appears to be increasingly encroaching on our own. And on the one hand, we might, be a little bit freaked out by this, right? We might say, well, actually, let's erect a sort of 2000-style threat level milestones, right? And if we ever get to the elevated level, like maybe we need to call for a pause and get a bunch of signatories. And I offer that semi-facetiously, but I think there's something there, right? Like Suresh Venkatasubramaniam has been advocating for the idea of building sensors to help us, figure out the way that our progress is evolving. But on the other hand, even with this progression of agency, maybe the aspects of human agency that are left are the most existentially significant, right? Where the large expanse of green that we're seeing here represent mundane or menial tasks that we're actually kind of happy to have automated away. And what that suggests to me is essentially, if we've got measures of agency, we might even be able to start to, craft arguments that are perhaps more persuasive to our colleagues in machine learning and AI. Because after all, benchmarks are their primary language, right? Benchmarks serve as their targets for new data sets and new models and new architectures. And so rather than, those benchmarks always staying true to the Turing test paradigm, maybe this is our way of asserting our values. And so just to wrap up here, I really like this chart from Jonathan Gruden's 2009 article in AAAI magazine, where he remarked that AI and HCI are two fields divided by a common focus, and you can see this pendulum sort of swing back and forth, right? Where in eras where there's increasing amount of automation, that usually comes at the expense of more HCI-esque approaches of intelligence augmentation. But I think we're actually in a pretty special moment in time, right? I think HCI is in a much stronger position than it ever has been. We've got so many fantastic senior HCI leaders who are in prominent positions of leadership in academia. I'm seeing some here, in industry. And I think we have a much greater ability as a field to act as a counterbalance against increasing amounts of automation. And to do that, I think we need to figure out ways of communicating and asserting our values and figuring out how we shape that future. And so thank you very much. Everything I've talked about is just the tippy top of an iceberg, which is behind this QR code and white paper. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arvind. And next we have Wendy.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. That's a tough act to follow, Arvind, but do I have slides? Yes. Okay. So, all right. I'm going to shift gears a little bit, but I'm still operating in the same kind of how do we think about AI and how do we think about its impact on us as a field, and how, more importantly, we as a field have something special to say about the relationship between human beings and technology, and particularly intelligent technology. So I have this provocative title about parasitic or symbiotic, and I want to think about how we reinterpret our relationship with intelligent systems. So let me start with something very sort of traditional, which is basically how do we think about interacting with computers? And there's several different basic models. There's the idea that we have a computer as a tool, and that's a traditional HCI way of thinking about it. We have tools that we do creativity support tools, and we build things and we visualize things, and we as designers design technology that helps people do stuff, but they get to do it. They remain in control, based on what Arvind's talking about. Now, the other thing is what you heard this morning in the keynote, which is the idea that we should be delegating our activities to a servant who then goes and conducts them for us. And we don't have to worry about it. We just let the other agent do it. And then finally, it's important to recognize that we also use computers as a medium, and it's a medium for exchange of information among people. And so all three of those come together, and it used to be fairly separated in terms of the fields that we are in, where AI is traditionally in the middle and HCI is on the left here, and so on, but now they're all getting merged. So the question is, if we talk to our research colleagues in AI, how do they think about users? They talk about user-centered AI, that comes up, but what do they mean by that? Well, the problem that we have is that AI researchers are measured in terms of their ability to make algorithms better. And so for them, the user is a source of data that helps them make their algorithm better, a source of error. So for example, they've taken on Tversky and Kahneman and confirmation bias and this bias and that bias, and oh, look at how biased users are, and we're going to have to, accommodate that in some way with our clever model. And the idea basically is that the human being is part of this complex machine, and it's kind of an annoying part of it. It's either sort of a necessary evil or it's a creator of problems to solve. Now, I also want to say something about AI algorithms, which is that there is this idea that there's some kind of universal world model, and we're not there yet, but we're going to get there, and somehow we'll just kind of make it, and in the meantime, we just want better and better algorithms. But the reality is that the same algorithm, if you have several different algorithms, one that's very, very expensive to use and another one that's very lightweight and easy to use, you may be able to create the same impact on the user because you have an interaction that allows the user to do what they want. So you can have the same interaction from the user's perspective and the same benefit to the user with very different algorithms. And by contrast, you can also have the same algorithm with different types of interaction that have radically different impact on users. So there's an example that I like to give, which is in the French Navy, there is a system where they created this intelligence system for plotting trajectories into a harbor. So you have the captain, and he gets this tool, and it says, you should use this one. And the captains just rejected it out of hand. But when that same tool was used as a afterthought, so you basically, the captain has to plot their own path, so they're maintaining their expertise and building on their expertise. But then the AI comes in and it says, this is a good path, but that path might give you this benefit, and here's this other trade-off. Then you've got a situation in which the user is benefiting from the AI. Same algorithm. It's not a better algorithm. It's not a worse algorithm. It's the same algorithm, but the interaction is different. And so what's happening here is that we are in a situation in which a better algorithm does not mean that it's necessarily a better system. It's neither necessary nor sufficient for having a great interaction with an intelligent system. So, again, just to summarize, if you're in this human in the loop kind of model and somebody says, yes, I do human in the loop, I'm thinking about users, what they're saying is users are part of this cog in the machine, but I am measuring my performance based on my algorithm, and I don't really care about the user. I assume sometime in the future somebody later on might do something useful with it, but that's not my problem as a researcher. And I flip it around and I say, for us here in this room, in human-computer interaction, and UIST in particular, because you guys are the ones who are technically capable of building these things and understanding them, and also thinking about the user, here the measure of success has to be that the user is performing better in some way. And performance might be enjoys it more, right? It's not necessarily faster. All right, so what we want to do is we want to think about how do we design an interactive environment that involves intelligent systems where users benefit from it. They are empowered, they gain skills. Do we have interaction where people get better at doing what they do rather than de-skilling? And do we let them control the interaction? All right, so that's kind of like where I am in terms of why I think it's really important for this audience in particular to think really hard about what it means to interact with intelligent systems. But I also want to say that we can learn a great deal from other sciences, particularly those that study interaction. We're not the only ones out there. And this is based on work that I've done with Michel Baudouin-Lafont and Susanna Bodker, what we call generative theories of interaction. I'm not going to talk about that today, but I recommend that you think about it. But the idea is that we can learn from other sciences that have a tremendous amount of data and experience and theory, both quantitative and qualitative, that allow us to learn from them and apply that in our environment. So I was very much influenced in the 1980s when I was doing my PhD, thinking about Gaia theory. And basically this notion of coevolution and the idea that we don't actually operate in a static environment. The environment that we're in, the reason that we breathe air is because there are anaerobic bacteria many, many, many millions or billions of years ago that started giving off oxygen, and they brought in carbon dioxide and created this environment, and then other organisms evolved with respect to that. And this is all traced back to James Lovelock and Lynn Margulies, and I recommend that you take a look at that. There's another piece of it, which is this notion of coevolution, which is a very sophisticated and very well-developed concept. This is where you have 2 or more species now that adapt to each other over long periods of time. And usually the mechanism with organisms is things like DNA and RNA and so on and so forth. Now, what is more appropriate for us is what I call co-adaptation. This also comes from Darwin. Both of these are from the 1800s. I didn't invent co-adaptation either. But the idea is that within an individual's lifetime, there's this notion of adapting to the environment, reacting to it, but also changing it, right? So if I'm a bird and I build a nest, I'm changing the environment to make it easier for me to lay eggs and have, baby birds. We do that all the time. We are tool users. There are affordances out in the world. There's properties to different objects, and we learn how to use those to change and form our environment. So if we think as designers about building interactive technology that is static in a static environment, we're wrong. That environment is changing. We are changing that environment. Other people are changing that environment, and the speed of change is going through the roof because AI is coming in and changing things at a much, much faster pace than we have been used to. So think about, how do organisms relate to each other? If you go back to evolutionary biology, there are different kinds of relationships that happen over time, and they can have positive, neutral, and negative impacts. And there's a whole set of different kinds of relationships, and if you go and read the literature, you can see that there's a lot of data and understanding about what's going on here. So let me transform that here and say, what if we apply this style of thinking to how human beings interact with intelligent systems or agents? And we want to think about, are we in a situation where we're creating a predatory environment? Are we parasitic? Or is it symbiotic in the sense that it's positive? What's going on here? So let me break this down a little bit. The notion of a symbiotic relationship is defined as a close, ongoing relationship between 2 species, and now here I'm thinking humans and agents, and multiple humans, multiple agents, right? It's complex. And at least one species benefits. The other relationship may be positive, may be neutral, or maybe negative. And there are different terms for this. So a mutualist one is one in which both benefit. So we can imagine environments and the sorts of things that Arvind was just talking about. You can have these situations where there's a positive benefit on both sides. You can also have ones in which it's commensalist, which is positive and neutral. And the one that scares me is the parasitic relationship, where we have positive and negative. And the challenge that I have for you is, in a symbiotic relationship, and I'm arguing that we're in a symbiotic relationship right now, I want it to be the human being that is always getting the benefit, and sometimes negative or neutral for the other, which is the AI system, which might be interpreted as large corporations that do AI, I don't know. But the idea is, how do we maintain these ongoing dynamic relationships where the environment is changing, the players are changing, everything is changing? How do we figure out how to make that a positive relationship? Now, what we have here is an example of a parasitic relationship, and I don't have time to go into lots of detail, but I'll give you some very quick examples. So for example, ChatGPT was created with a bunch of people in Kenya who were paid less than $2 an hour to make ChatGPT less toxic. So when you use ChatGPT to do something, like to write a letter to, your friend about, RSVP to something or other, there's somebody else, a real human being somewhere, who has been charged to actually make that less toxic as a relationship. And that is something where they've been in a very negative environment, and it's been very costly to the human, and the result is that we've got a very high-performing ChatGPT. Another kinds of thing is commensalism. So I'll give you a very quick example here. This is where one benefits and the other, it's neutral. So if somebody's collecting data from you and it doesn't hurt you, but it helps them build a better algorithm, that might be a commensalist relationship. And finally, the one that's most interesting is how do you do these positive or mutualist environments. So a good example right now is what's been happening in medicine, and particularly cases of medical imaging where the doctors, the radiologists, have been working with these AI systems, and together they do better. The radiologists learn from the AI, and the AI is learning from the radiologists, and the sum total is something that's better for everybody. So that's more the goal that what we want. I want to do a little aside, which I probably don't have time to do, but I just want to say that there's this notion that we have of evolution and survival of the fittest, and what does that mean? And there's this idea that it's going to be everybody, you know, predator-prey relationships. But that's not actually always the case. And part of this is an artifact of what happened historically, which is that Darwin went to the Galapagos Islands. And this is in a very mild environment. It's a very sort of balmy, easy to live in kind of environment. And what he saw was tremendous competition among the species because they could all grow and whatever. And what was causing them to have to reduce their populations were other organisms. It wasn't the environment. But there's another guy, Pyotr, I can't pronounce his name properly, but Kropotkin, was an evolutionary biologist who was a Russian studying evolutionary biology in Siberia. And what he found was in a very, very harsh environment in which it's very difficult to survive, organisms, even predator and prey relationships, are much more collaborative. And there's all kinds of collaborating in terms of being able to survive with respect to the environment. So survival of the fittest does not necessarily mean against your competitor. It might also be competing to, collaborating together in the face of a harsh environment. And so one of the questions I have, are we creating a harsh environment with what's happening now? So there's Kropotkin in Siberia. So let me just give you a quick example of that with the World Wide Web when it first came on. The early internet was new and it was hard to use. And so what you saw spontaneously crop up was lots of human beings collaborating in different ways. So there's Yahoo, which is curating cool websites. There's Wikipedia, which helps, you know, create an encyclopedia for the world. There's people doing how-to YouTube videos that show people how to do things. And that still exists. But what we've seen now when we have AI coming in is this other force, which is because of the financial incentives, which say that more clicks gives more money, and what gets more clicks is you draw more attention, and that means what we get is trolling behavior, or we get addictive behavior. You get people doom scrolling, you get people sort of immersed in these environments. We have places where we foster mistrust and create fraud. So we're in this very complex environment, and we're not measuring it in the way that we should be. I also wanted to say that there's a scale issue here. We can look, and we as a community, when we do our studies with users, we're generally looking at individual users. And I have to say this is true for me. I mostly am looking at individuals or maybe small groups of people. But of course we have to think about the impact not only on the individual, but on groups of users, and ultimately on society in general. And there's multiple societies, right? It's different in Europe than it is in North America. It's different in Asia, and so on. And finally, there is this notion of scope in terms of time. So we can look easily at short-term relationships, and we have a lot of tools for running experiments, both qualitative and quantitative, that allow us to understand what that interaction looks like in the short term. But as we move out into the medium and longer term, what's happening is that's a very dynamic environment that's changing, the environment's changing, the players are playing, and that gets much harder to imagine. So, all right, so what's my vision? So I want us to use this idea of co-adaptation, the idea that users both learn from the system. So as a designer, you create a system and you create something that people can learn from, but that they can also adapt it and appropriate in useful ways. And they will do it anyway. People adapt your systems all the time. It's part of what we do as human beings. But I want to create this in such a way that it's a positive relationship as possible. And then to add that in where we have intelligent agents that also can learn from and manipulate human behavior. All four of those are happening. So I'm going to just do some quick examples here. How am I doing on time? Badly. We can discover things. So adaptability means I have to make systems that are discoverable. So I want to be able to learn how to express things with my technology. I want to be able to have my human individuality expressed through the system. I want to be able to adapt the technology, to customize it, and I want to meet my personal needs, and I also want to appropriate it and reinterpret it for different reasons. And that's what I call a human-computer partnership. Okay. I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. These are old examples. My apologies to Mira and Alex. I've shown these before, but they explain the ideas relatively quickly. So on a very simple level, if I want you to learn how to use gesture-based interaction on the phone where every gesture you use is tied to a command, you're going to have to learn how to use it. If you're an expert, you want to just do it. But if you're a novice, you're going to hesitate. And it's that point that I want to have a dynamic guide show up and show me what to do. So that's what this looks like here. The idea is if I hesitate, it shows me the possibilities. I can follow through with it. And here we have the desired command, in this case, call Alice. The things that are less important disappear slowly, gradually, and then it goes on. And yet, of course, an expert can just do that. And you can see he goes part of the way through, hesitates, and then it goes. Anyway. Expressivity, here's another one. When you all talk, you text with your phones, right? And some of you use swipe typing or gesture typing, which was invented by Shuman Yishai, who is in the room somewhere. Brilliant idea. You can go much faster. You can swipe type. And there you have this idea that you want to be able to, that the AI's role is to figure out what word you want. But one of the things that's different is when we write with handwriting, my handwriting is different than from Michelle's or from Mira's or from Alex's or from Arvind's, and that individual expression is lost. So the question is, how do we have a way of capturing that so that we both figure out the correct word and capture that individual variation under the user's control? So this is a system that we made. We worked with a professional typographer, and he created a set of fonts, and we can change the color, and we can change the font, and whether it's bold or not, based on the style of the gesture. So they're just using basic gesture typing here, but the way in which she interacts affects the outcome. And people learn how to do this very quickly. Motor skills are learned much more quickly than some other things. Anyway, customizability. This is another one where you want to be able to personalize things. So this is a system that we created called Fieldword. Here we're again trying to create gesture commands, but instead of having to learn the ones that are already in the system, maybe I want to create my own. But my needs and the AI system's needs are different. So I want something that's easy for me to remember, and the AI system needs to know something that is easy to distinguish from the other commands in the command set. So what we do is we create a dynamic environment that shifts between red and blue. And the idea is that if I do a gesture that ends in blue, that means it's good gesture, and the system can distinguish it, and I can be happy with it. If it ends in red, it's not distinguishable. Anyway, so let's see what that looks like. You can see the color is changing dynamically, and I can respond. Here's one. It stops there. It red. It's not going to work. Not going to work. But if he goes off here, it ends in blue, and that works, all right? So the idea here is that we can embed all kinds of little bits of information and dynamic stuff that reveals to the user how the system is interpreting the user's behavior and let them control it in a way that makes sense to them. I'm going to skip through this one, but we also have ways of doing appropriability. I also have to say I have some nicer examples, but they're submitted to Kai, so I'm not going to show them to you. Anyway, my students will get mad at me if I do. All right, so here we have this notion of co-adaptation, and that is a situation in which users are doing all of those different kinds of things with respect to the system. But what happens when the system is actively controlling elements of the user's behavior? So all of this was from the human perspective, but now when we have AI, there's agency over there, and it really relates to what Arvind was talking about. So here we have the user adapting to the system and controlling it, and then the system adapts to the user and controls the user. And that can be used for good or ill. Here I go to my initial training was as an experimental psychologist and looking at behavior theory and how you can use reinforcement learning, the real stuff, not the stuff that the AI guys do, the real thing. It's more complicated than that. Anyway, but we can really control user behavior in very effective ways that are for good or for ill. And that should be measured and thought about. All right, so I'm going to end here with a little tiny thing which I've shown to some people. But I want to talk about, we should be thinking about interaction as our focus. Interaction is a phenomenon. It's something that exists. It's back and forth between users and systems, and especially intelligent systems. And if we treat that as a phenomenon in its own right, not separate from what do humans do and what do systems do, but that back and forth between them is critically important. And that's what we in HCI and UIST in particular have expertise in, and we should be building our expertise there. And if we want to create human-computer partnerships that have these positive symbiotic relationships, what we want to do is think about what are the best features of humans and best features of the computers. And I'm going to give you one last example, which is one that I've used. Some of you may have seen this before, but the idea is that if I'm talking about a partnership, it has a lot to do with who's in control. So the idea is if I use a transportation metaphor, and I want to take a taxi because I don't know, like I'm in Pittsburgh and I don't know how to get to the banquet event or whatever it is, it's easier for me to just call an Uber, call a taxi, and let the driver figure that out. I delegate all the control. And there are times when that is exactly what I want to do. But there are other situations in which I actually enjoy doing the task. Here is somebody driving a motorcycle. If you imagine, people are not building self-driving Ferraris. It just isn't a thing. The idea is that sometimes I want expertise. I want to be able to use that, and I want to be able to go out and take advantage of that. So when I'm driving a motorcycle, it's partly transportation, sure, but it's also fun to drive. And so the third idea here is a partnership with an intelligent agent should be closer to what you get with a horse. So if I'm a kid and I get a new horse, lucky me, I get to grow up with the horse gets to know me, I get to know the horse. It's a different kind of intelligence than mine. It's got different capabilities, and there's this back and forth relationship. There's shared control. And what we should be thinking about is how do we create these shared control relationships between users and systems, particularly intelligent systems, that have this positive element where both benefit, rather than trying to do things where there's some corporation somewhere that's earning lots of money, but a lot of people are being abused. So I think we can combine these different kinds of relationships and control the interaction. And the idea here is we must never forget that what we're doing as a field is we are creating interactions with technology where the impact of that technology on the user is what's critical. We do not have the excuse that our AI colleagues have of saying, all I care about is the algorithm. I did a better algorithm, I'm done. No. We do interaction, and we have to pay attention to that. And as Arvind said, we have more power than we used to. They do listen to us more. They don't listen to us enough, but more. And I think it's a really important role that we have to play in insisting that measuring and understanding the role of interaction is critical. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Great job. Thank you, Wendy, and thank you all. Next, we're going to transition to a Q&A. So please stand up and line up with your questions. you all heard me. Stand up and ask your questions. Please line up. We have mics ready for all of you.
And I think, yeah, please, we can just go because we're a little bit short on time.
Hi, I'm Diane Hu from Carnegie Mellon University. I am an interaction designer. So back a few days ago, I was in a colloquium with a group of professionals from School of Design, and they were talking about how designers are less involved in the designing for next generation technology and designing for next user interface. And that's why I came here trying to find what my value is in this community as a designer, especially as a female designer. So I'd like to both of you share your thoughts about this. Thank you.
Well, first of all, there's a tremendously important role of designers, and I would say that you see less of that at this particular conference, but of course there are other conferences within the greater HCI umbrella. So you have the CHI conference, which kind of covers everything, and there's conferences like DIS that think about it. I agree with you that there's not enough design in AR and VR environments, but there absolutely can be. And part of that is figuring out how to, I don't know that I have any particular, like how to crack into that community, but it means you have to collaborate with them and show them different ways of thinking about what they're doing. Designers are wonderful because here's one. Engineers are trained to follow the rules. So if somebody on an exam says, you have to calculate this thing, you don't get to say, I don't want to calculate that one. I'm going to calculate this other one. Great, right? No. But if you're a designer, you get to challenge the design brief. And you get to say, well, yes, I've designed this thing, but it's different because I decided that. It's a wonderfully different way of thinking. And it's an example of why collaborations between designers and engineers could be very powerful, because they have different ways of attacking problems, and sometimes very powerful ones. You want to add anything?
Wow, I don't think I can beat that about a ode to design. That was fantastic, yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
Hello, my name is Yuan Liu at the University of Notre Dame. Thank you for the very great talks. I want to specifically follow up with Arvind on your framework of agency. It's my third time hearing you talking about this topic. Every time I learn something new. You're all good. So specifically about the dynamic part about interaction design, when you say you can specify the syntax and semantic for the task scenario the user is working in. I see that's very interesting. A question I want to ask is, when it gets, I can see that on a spectrum, when it gets more dynamic, the cognitive load or the work that the user have to do to learn what is getting displayed to them gets significantly higher, especially when it's like more fluid and more dynamic and newer every single time. So how do you see we do the balance, not necessarily designers define all of the task boundaries as you showed, but also getting a little more fluid and interactive every time a new task scenario is given to the user and to the model, I guess.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think that is part of the research question, right? I think you sort of like put your finger on it, which is, so one of the sources of inspiration of how I've been thinking about this is my colleague Daniel Jackson, who thinks about how we redesign software in terms of the concepts that are embodied in the software. And he has this really nice idea in one of his papers of a concept library, right? Where, there exists somewhere out in the world a repository that defines, what the concepts are and maybe ways that you could imagine an AI agent sort of like synthesizing, relationships between those concepts or things like that. Now, as I understand, if I'm channeling my inner Daniel Jackson, I would say that like the way that those concepts are designed are right now purely in terms of how they manifest in software, right? So it's about the action, the state, that kinds of stuff. But what you're suggesting is that maybe you also need to define things like a user performance model associated with some of these concepts or things like that, right? So we need to figure out, first of all, and that gets at, where I was ending, right, is like, what are ways of measuring and quantifying agency? Like certainly, cognitive effort is probably one of these things, right? So one of the sort of like sleights of hand I pulled there is that it's not strictly true if you have more expressive power that you have more agency. If like, you have to write D3 code, which I love D3, but it's really hard, right? And so do you really have agency if you have to exert all of this this sort of effort? TBD.
Hi, Ian Arajo, University of Montreal. This is also a question for Arvind, but it's inspired by Wendy's connections. I really love the sort of mutualism connection here. So in terms of designing new human-AI interfaces, is there a sense in which we can look for inspiration from other disciplines of design or history as we move into this sort of new age of designing for agency? One thing that comes to mind for me is game design, where people basically create constrained possibility spaces. So I was interested, have you sort of thought about making connections with other fields in the same way that Wendy has?
Yeah, I mean, I think Wendy has a better answer here probably, because I'm a huge fan of the way that her and Michelle have sort of worked with, musicians and artists, and I guess that's not a style of working that comes naturally to me, but what I have done, particularly, as we've been thinking through these ideas, is look at other fields outside of HCI, outside of computer science, that I feel conceptual resonance with. So in particular, clearly all of this draws heavily on linguistic anthropology, but as I was trying to sort of put together a set of slides that would be convincing to you all, I fell down a rabbit hole in cognitive science as well. And there's really interesting things in there, like, the sort of work that our capstone speaker last year, Judy Fan, is working on. So I think there's tons that we can learn from other disciplines, be they design, and I look to Wendy here, but yeah, outside as well.
Can I answer that a little bit too? Because we have actually worked with game designers, and one of my students was influenced by all of the theory that I didn't present all the theory. We've got a lot of stuff, but he basically was very inspired by what he calls narrative substrates. But the idea is that players in games, MMORPGs, they're following a story, but there's a huge amount of sort of discord, discussions, and things like that surrounding that, and a huge social environment that's gotten up. And so what he created was a way of having players embed elements into the story and have that be part of changing the environment. So it's very much like the game environment is this sort of Gaia idea, and that you're kind of creating elements where the players, through their actions, end up embedding elements that other players can build on and creating this more. So it's, you have this sort of sandboxy thing with like Minecraft or something. It's not that. It's really already in an environment with real stories in it, but people adding to those stories and having that evolutionary element happening. And he built a real company, and they really do that. So anyway, it's cool.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Alan from University of Rochester. I'm working on AI agents now, so I resonate very deeply with both of your speech today. My question today is, what is your perspective on whether or not the language models, or basically all the AI systems nowadays, do they already possess the capability and can be used as a foundation to realize the kind of symbiotic relationship, the kind of a dynamic agency and co-evolution, co-adaptation kind of thing? Or is it still something left for the AI people to do, and designers should also help them to do those stuff? Yeah.
I'm going to answer this differently, which is some of my favorite AI people are people who do interactive machine learning. And the idea is that you're not relying on some massive database out there of everything. I mean, you actually do benefit from the fact that a bunch of things have already been trained and so on. But the idea is that when you're working with artists, for example, dancers or people doing movement, they want to be defining their own ways of interacting and so on, and they're building more localized, personalized, smaller interactive machine learning things. And so I personally don't think, I don't think there's enough out there, but I don't think there will be 5 years from now either, because it's always historical, it's always in the past, and it's not forward directed. And I really appreciate the people who are doing this kind of interactive, personalizable kind of thing that really targets a particular area. I don't know if you have a different...
I mean, just for fun, I'll maybe, say yes, in that it depends on what we mean by, like, is it good enough, right? I think it's good enough in the sense of I'm not expecting to take an off-the-shelf Claude or whatever and stick it right into an open design space, right? What I'm expecting is, and I think some of our speakers already today have described it in terms of, foundation model, frontier model, what have you, which is that that's a great initial step. And now I'm going to fine-tune it, et cetera, for my specific domain or task, right? So I think partly, now this is my like hot take, right? Which is like fine-tuning used to be much more popular than, like it's fallen out of favor, right? We've all been enamored by prompt engineering and we've forgotten about fine-tuning. And I think fine-tuning still should play a really important role. Yeah, so I don't know. Let's run with that for now, yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much for 2 really wonderful talks. And I think one of the things that I really appreciated about both of your talks was really the connection and the focus on these types of interactive systems that we want to have being centered much more around joint activities with these systems, and joint activities being in the sense of like, shared cooperative activities from Bratman, et cetera. But I think one of the challenges that I see, and I think you both spoke to this a little bit, is, when we think about the rich ways that we collaborate with people and other animals and other animals working together, these joint activities that people are doing sort of necessarily require us to have the ability to sort of mutually be able to predict and also understand what people are people doing and thinking. And so I think one question I have is maybe related to the last one, which is that, is this, in a true, looking at the vision that you're projecting of these joint cooperative activities, does that need this, ability for mentalizing, for theory of mind? Or can we, find ways to constrain the problem in a deeper way? Because I think, again, the richness that you're looking at in terms of the way that we might interact with even a horse may require us to be able to predict the horse's motion. And I don't think we can always predict these AI systems. And certainly the horse also needs to think about what our goals are and be able to predict those and monitor them. And again, I don't think these AI systems have a good way of really right now knowing what our goals are. So, yeah.
I can start with that. That's great and very intriguing question. I'm actually not a fan of trying to figure out how to model the horse or the human. I think that's too hard. Because I don't think, we as human beings, we are a combination of electrical and chemical and dynamic processes, and there's some information processing stuff that is similar in some ways, but every time I see an AI model that is based on something that I know deeply about, like reinforcement learning is one, or diversity and Kahneman and those kinds of things, it's a very, very oversimplified view of what's actually going on. There's another approach, and this is something that I'm doing with Michelle, who's standing in line back there, which is to try to think about how we create a more coherent, actually Jim Holland is also in there, there's this sort of physics of interaction. The idea of creating something that is more predictable from a human point of view, that is more explainable. Old style AI with rule-based stuff was closer to that view. We've gotten away from that. But there's something to be said about sort of building in sort of digital affordances, if you will, that people can then react to and manipulate. They can learn, they can also appropriate in different ways. And the system, if you're going to do explainable AI, I think you have to be able to explain it in human terms that people care about. Nobody wants to know how the model works. Well, there's very few people who want to know how the model works. But most normal users who are doing something else want to know what its impact is on them and what they can predict. So I think you're exactly right. Is this an easy problem? Not at all. It's huge. But it does mean that where we are right now is a series of historical accidents, right? We did not design the environment that we're in. There's some major things like Steve Jobs and the phone and the way we interact with mobile phones, and now all mobile phones sort of look the same and so on. We could rethink some of that, and some of that should be rethought. And if we can do that rethinking and embed elements that are more predictable from a human point of view, then we don't have to model it. We can just have human beings do what human beings are good at, which is figure it out. I don't know.
Yeah, I think my riff on what Wendy's describing is why I like thinking about all of this from like a linguistic point of view, right? So I think part of the reason that model behavior is difficult to predict is that everything is learned and expressed latently. And so we don't know what the semantics are, or if we had to say that the model had learned semantics, it's like semantics about everything, as though that's a thing, right? And so figuring out, sort of related to my answer to the previous question, like if we can figure out how we can express, the semantics and syntaxes for our domains and tasks, and then use that as the common ground or the bridge. So there's some work that my PhD student Angie Bogust is leading that is trying to do that. So as a very concrete example, like I was showing you, in visualization, and as you know, like we have formal models, right? The grammar of graphics. Now, one of the things we've done in my group is train models on data sets of chart images, chart captions, et cetera. And one of the things that Angie and one of our master students, Helen Bang, is looking at is, has a model learned a grammar of graphics? And if not, what has it learned in terms that we could either re-express in terms of the grammar of graphics, or say, we can start with the grammar of graphics and try to fit it on what the model has learned and figure out what the misalignments are, right? And if there are important misalignments, those have to have some meaning. So what meaning do we ascribe to them, right? And that, I think, is perhaps a way that it's not really predictability per se, but it's, again, kind of like common grounding, perhaps.
Hey, Wendy. Hey, Arvind. Bjorn Hartman, UC Berkeley. Thanks for the 2 inspirational talks. I wanted to loop back to the very first question, which I thought was very on point. Like, what's the role of design and designers in this human AI interaction future? It's very selfish as someone who started a design and technology master's program. But I want to zoom in on something that Arvind said, that in the future we might be more opening these design spaces rather than creating point solutions in that space. And first off, I'm totally on board with that. As all my students know, I love talking about design spaces and thinking of problems as spaces of solutions that they fit into. But then it also reminded me of the not so successful history of model-based UI design in the 90s, where we were talking about defining abstract UI representations and then rendering concrete ones depending on task and context, etc. I was just reflecting, why was that not so successful? Probably many reasons, but one seemed to be that that way of thinking was not aligned with what designers do. And so if you read Nigel Cross, Designly Ways of Knowing, right, what do designers do is they generate concrete solution proposals, multiple of them, and then reason about what do they have in common, what are the strengths and shortcomings. And so that, it kind of leaves me with a question of, where does that leave us? Is this a question of reinventing design education? That seems like a pretty big lift and maybe not something one should attempt to do, given that it's very successful in many ways. Does it mean we need new tools that infer spaces from concrete examples? does it mean there's a shift of power balance and who gets to create things, and how do we maybe countersteer that? So those were all questions that came up in my mind from that first great question to you, and I just wanted you to expand on that a little bit.
You want to try to start?
Why did I pitch a proposal here? Yeah. What a fantastic question. So let me start to put together an answer, which is, I caveat this by saying I guess I'm not a designer in the sense that you mean, right? So I design things, but I don't have training in that. So, you should push back on my answer. I think what I mean when I say point solutions versus what I'm hoping for with these open design spaces is perhaps the shift that we saw in HCI where, the stuff in the 90s was around developing toolkits. And I don't know that we see as much toolkit work now as we used to, right? But we see a lot of systems work. And so maybe part of what I'm trying to grasp at or reach for is like a return to that style of work, right? Where you use the point solution, you still do the point-wise exploration, but then you figure out like what the step of, I don't know that it's generalization necessarily that I'm trying to describe here so much as like step of abstraction. Now, whether it's designers who we want to task with doing that step of abstraction, I'm not sure, right? I think you're right that designers are really good at doing the point-wise exploration. And I'm not trying to suggest that we ought to stop doing the point-wise exploration so much as we shouldn't, wait, what did I just say? Yeah, we shouldn't stop at that, right?
I'm going to take a different kind of
attack. Excellent.
Partly because we spend a lot of time watching designers and working with designers, and there's this kind of back and forth between concrete and abstract thinking. And so if you go to a good designer, they have a huge number of concepts in their heads about things that they want to do. They have understanding of color, they have understanding of shape, they have a really good idea of what they're conveying in a sketch. So I'm not a very good sketcher, but the person who did some of the graphics there is a very talented sketcher, and it looks very sketchy, but if you look at his initial sketch and the final sketch, there's this real progress that he goes through. It's because he has deep knowledge about what he's trying to do. And I do not, under any circumstances, want to make it harder for designers to be designers. I really want to figure out how to help them do that. And I don't think taking out the easy bits is necessarily the solution. Sort of delegate the easy bits and humans will do the hard, interesting stuff. That's an easy excuse for automating part of the thing. I think the harder bit is to sort of figure out how you help people. I don't want to make people creative. I'm assuming they're creative. What I want to do is help them make this transition back and forth between their abstractions, which can then be used elsewhere, and maybe an AI system can, and their exploration. There's this notion of exploratory work where you're trying things out, you're comparing things, you're looking at it, and you're trying to figure out what you want to keep and what you want to leave. And the tool should be helping people capture that, right? Capture that ability to figure out what's the appropriate abstraction in this particular case, rather than, here's the model, I'm going to impose it on you, the user. And that's where I think it breaks. It's got to be designer driven, but it's really hard to do.
One more thought to add to this, which I just haven't heard yet, but I really liked in Arvind's presentation, is the word language jumped out at me. And especially today, we have so much new exciting work around conversational interfaces. And so how these conversational interfaces fit with existing interfaces is, I think, a big open question. And I think from a design point of view, I think it's having to expand the scope of like what is an interface really, and how do conversational interfaces fit into that? And I wanted you to add a conversational bit to your video demo, because I wanted to tell the system, I want this type of visualization, but now change it like this, right? Without having to go find another example. And so that's, I think, another piece to think about is really this notion of language.
Maybe one thing I'm just curious, like, perhaps design education should change? Like, should we be teaching designers to do a step of abstraction? Maybe not all of abstraction, but maybe it's not the worst thing in the world for designers to have to at least take a first whack at it. I don't know.
I was just doing some workshops with people who are publishers, and they're a combination of designers and people doing combined print and online publishing. So a very interesting group. And this guy was talking about how a number of people are self-taught designers who are doing this stuff, and they really struggle with InDesign and various other tools. And he was taught with a sort of computational approach. He started out as a computer scientist and moved into design, and he was able to think about these abstractions first and lay things out that way and work with it. And he found that he was in a much better position than they were. And I think, and he teaches now design at one of the design schools in Paris, and teaches it that way because it's really important that they understand these abstractions. And I've been invited to talk to a design school, the École Boulle in Paris, about, because they're desperately scared of AI. These are the faculty in the design school, and they don't know how it's going to impact. And their students are saying, we're going to need to know about AI. Can you teach us? And they're going, no, that's not our thing. And so there is this wave that is washing over them right now. And there are things I think will have to change in design education, but I don't want it to be the idea that we're going to impose a model on them. It's more like allowing them to understand the principles of creating models that are effective for what they're doing. And I also think the tools should be supporting that. So that's why I like your approach. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, hello, I'm Harish from University of Texas at Arlington. So this is a general question. So especially from both of your presentations, the one common question that has been appearing is, should the AI should be empowering humans and it should not depower them? So in that aspect, one of my general thoughts is it really difficult to put up I mean, it's not just in design, in any type of human AI interaction or human computer interaction. Is it very difficult to add a control factor to such a way that, I mean, if the model can recognize, okay, the human is really getting addicted to this model or system, that it might depower them, so we should put a control in such a way that, okay, you shouldn't use it too often, so you should also rely on your own skills. So is it very difficult to enable such kind of a control factor, especially in development of any kind of human-computer interactive systems that involves AI?
I'm going to say yes, it's really difficult. It's extremely difficult because it matters so much, the context. And it matters who is making the rules, and it matters who the user is. And there are situations which it's great for Arvind, but might be terrible for me, or it might be good for the two of us, but terrible for Mira. And that's a human social thing. So it's not like there is some kind of ground truth about what is the right thing to do. It's super context dependent. And so there are things that we can probably in general do better. And I do think we should be measuring things so we at least know what's happening. But doing it systematically is extremely difficult, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Very hard. I mean, there's lots of research in sort of AI safety, AI ethics that has tried to do this, right? So constitutional AI, et cetera. I don't think there's a good answer. I think, for the reasons that Wendy describes, which is it's hard to articulate a universal set of safety considerations, except for the most obvious ones, right? Like the AI shouldn't suggest something heinous, or sure, but that's not really the set of concerns that I think most of us are most worried about, right? In some sense, the stuff that you can expressly articulate in a constitution is the easiest set of things. And even at that stage, you know, I can't remember which of the big models it was, but I think at some point they released a model update where they just cranked like the tiniest little bit in their safety, and like the quality of the model output just cratered. And so there's still stuff that we don't understand very well about, you know, how the models are being as sort of, you know, fluid in the output that they're producing. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Muzhe from Carnegie Mellon. First of all, thank you so much for the inspiring talk. So I think both of your talk emphasize on the sort of finding the balance between user or human control versus like system or like agent control. And both of you grounded in like different theories. For example, I think Arvind mentioned like we should determine different tasks, and Wendy mentioned like different ecological relationship between sort of human and agent. I'm wondering like specifically, how do you imagine we should come up with this you know, fine-grained power dynamics or like structure of this kind of relationship? Is it gonna, should we, you know, more proactively to design research into different, you know, domain contexts, potentially collaborating with domain or task experts, or should we sort of wait and see how like AI capability evolve? Well, I guess the first approach will be more, you know, healthy, but I guess in reality, probably it's more likely it's the second case. For example, like ChatGPT coming out of nowhere, I guess for most of the people. So I wonder what's the like the most appropriate or reasonable approach, like methodology of doing this. Thanks.
I can try. First of all, I think you have to collaborate. And secondly, I think one problem that I see is that a lot of people who are building technology are mathematicians or engineers, which is important because they need those skills to do that. But they aren't necessarily trained as scientists. And scientists are looking at trying to understand phenomena that exist in the world, right? And it could be, you know, about the climate, it could be about human relationships, it could be about, you know, all kinds of different things, so sort of understanding things. And so we learn a tremendous amount by the fact that they have already learned, they have massive amounts more data than we do about how the real world actually works. And they have theories that they can use that can help them understand that. So this is why it's really productive for you to work, you know, with somebody who's an anthropologist who has that wealth of understanding. And me working with designers, I'm not a designer by training, but I've learned a tremendous amount by working with them. So I think we have to collaborate, and we have to recognize that there are elements of that are well. Mark Zuckerberg said that when he was really surprised when social media came out and there was all these kind of negative things. It's like, wow, who could have ever predicted? Wow. Talk to any psychologist and they would get, yeah, obviously that's going to happen. That's the way it works, right? So we know a lot already. And so we should be collaborating with people who know a lot. I'm not sure that we know enough, but they know a lot of stuff. And I think we, as a field, need to be reaching out to them, not just to treat them as a source of data for helping them build a model about, you know, how to read an X-ray, but looking at what they actually know as scientists and feeding that back into what we're trying to do. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but it's something.
I mean, I have a thought, which is, you know, in visualization, we have this style of work called a design study. And it's actually very comparable to, you know, design probes and technology probes, where the idea is that you are, you know, the visualization researcher, but to learn something new about visualization, what you have to do is go really, really deep with a domain expert. So it's often with biologists, with chemists, with et cetera, et cetera. And the goal is, yes, you build out like a piece of, you know, visualization software for them, but then you come back and, you know, reflect on the work that you've done with them, where the idea is you are contributing to visualization theory in some way, right? Our understanding of data or tasks or visual idioms or what have you. And I think something similar we need to do with you know, problems in this domain. yeah, we definitely shouldn't wait to get to the second part of your question. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, we're both going.
My name is Michel Baudouin-Lafont. I'm from Paris, France. Well, great talks, guys. So the program of AI historically was understanding humans and mimicking or replicating, how you want to look at it, human intelligence. And so the result is that now we have systems that we interact with through human means in terms of natural language. We type prompts all day long. But looking at what Wendy was describing so we have the tool-based approach, and so the user does everything. We have the partner approach where we delegate everything. And if we're going to shift to that, it means we're shifting to human relationships, human to artificial human relationships. Now, judging by what's happening in the world, I don't think this is going very well. And so my question is, it seems, if I understood Wendy's talk correctly, that we need to invent a new species, right? Where we can have mutualist relationships with this new species. Like we need to invent the horse. So can you see modalities of interaction that are not going towards either tool or sort of a human-based? What is the third way?
Wow, thanks.
You're welcome.
Yeah, sure. The answer is yes. Done. Yeah, okay. That's a toughie. You saw why we said, uh-oh, when he's coming up. Yeah. I do think, actually, though, that it does fit into this idea that we want to rethink what the computational environment that people are using. And we're in this really amazing period where a number of ways of sensing things is just lightweight, cheap sensors are everywhere, and this community knows a whole lot about that stuff, right? And we can create new kinds of styles of interaction that are much easier to sort of fit into our daily lives in certain ways. And so I think there's tremendous potential there. The harder bit for me is the more intellectual side of this. Like, I figure, like, the horse can move, that part we kind of know about to do, but the way the horse thinks and reacts and responds to us, there's a lot of research left, and I don't believe, I personally don't believe that we're going to get there. And like, given the thing that you showed of Mary's paper, the super intelligent stuff, I don't think we're even remotely close to that, because they don't work the way we do, and we don't understand how we work. And so it's very hard to come up with another species that works in a useful way. I actually kind of like simplicity. I'm going to make a little pitch, because nobody's asked about it, I'm surprised, about sustainable AI. And the idea of sustainability is involved here, because a lot of these algorithms are extremely expensive and getting more. And I mean in terms of energy consumption, water consumption, effect on users, and all those kinds of things. And so one of the things is, can we create simpler, use some of the pattern matching and other kinds of elements of what we've learned from AI, but in a simpler, more sustainable way. So I've completely shifted the question, and so yeah, sustainability, rah.
Well, so I'm going to try out an answer, which is that one of the things I cut from my talk, because I thought it was a little bit too galaxy-brained, is that yes, like, I'm inspired by sort of like interpersonal kind of conversational dynamics, but essentially sort of what the partnership that I think is actually playing out is not a partnership between sort of two collaborators, though that's the analogy that I was using. It's actually a partnership between the user and the designer, right? So in traditional user interfaces, that was not a partnership, it was a one-way relationship, right? The designer had a conceptual model of what the interface ought to be and said, hey, user, you gotta use it or that's it, right? And now I think there's an opportunity for that to be a much more bi-directional relationship, where the designer says, here is my suggestion, and the user gets to push back or say, no, actually, right? And that kind of dynamic is mediated not necessarily by what we consider to be the interface, but rather by the interface AI agent, right? And so the slide that I dropped was titled something like, you know, co-producing conceptual models between like users and designer. Like, you can see why I dropped the slide, but right, like that's what I'm trying to get at, right?
Thank you.
Hello, I'm David Little from Autodesk Research. And first, amazing talk. I really enjoyed it. And I think especially because it gives us really nice terms to reflect on and think about things. And I guess trigger warning for my question is that it's going to get dark. I'm going to picture two different worlds. In one of them, we have this gold mine where now we can create all these tools for authoring, where we have different building blocks that actually enable people to do things they couldn't do before. So now you have like a random creator at home who films a video on their phone in the kitchen and can suddenly make a full production where he doesn't need actors, he doesn't need like a soundtrack, he can just make it, and it'll be, to some degree, like a lot of things that he's good at will be great, the things that he's not good at will be, you know, good enough. And it's a sort of idea of like you have these specialized generalists that kind of like fills in the gaps with AI. Now there's another world where you have artists who are grieving, who are saying, hey, you know, I lost my job, or my colleague lost my job, and I'm not okay with using AI technology because I am in many ways like incentivizing and like doing this, and it's not okay. We also have a lot of platforms that are becoming more and more like walled gardens, where they don't want you taking the data out, they just want you putting data in, right? And so I think that the only difference between these two worlds comes down to the environment. And I don't know to what extent we can actually change all of that, because it becomes much more systemic and big, right? So yeah, I wanted to hear your thoughts. I was gonna like preface by saying like, are we doomed? Is it over? Are we too late? But I don't think we are, and I would just love to hear your take on this.
My brain is given out. Yeah.
Well, I guess, I mean, I talk to those designers, and they are worried, and I'm worried for them, and I'm also worried for some of us. You know, I've been doing this long enough. I'm going to retire, and it's not going to bother me. Well, it will, kind of. But at some level, yeah, I think there's a real issue of, because there's a lowering of there's a lot of papers that you see where this is for novices, and I'm going to let novices do something that's a little bit better. It's kind of crappy, but you know, we're going to let them do something. And the experts over there are going, I spent 4 years in design school, and I figured out all this stuff, and I can do something that's like this. Why are you like letting them do this thing that's going to take my job? And I think it's a real issue, and I don't think we are spending enough time. I'm in a European environment rather than an American or North American environment, and it does feel different there. There is more of a sense of we really need to be figuring out how to protect people's jobs and how to think about managing AI in a way that is sustainable. But of course, there's this huge competitive environment with North America and Asia as well. And so there's these big power plays going on, and it's just super, it's above my pay grade, I think.
Damn, that was going to be my answer of above my pay grade. But so the one thing that I'll say is, you know, that's sort of why I ended on kind of asking about what might be quantifiable, quantitative, you can see, right, end of the day, last session, yada, yada. Quantifiable measures of something like agency, right? On the surface, it can feel like that is a totally antithetical to the idea of agency, right? And certainly, well, I'm lucky to work with an anthropologist who is amenable to my like harebrained ideas, like let's quantify agency, but certainly, you know, that's not perhaps a widely shared point of view in anthropology. But the reason I sort of suggest that is because, yes, I think part part of the thing we need to do is regulation, but what are the regulators going to regulate, right? Like we need to give them, like I was saying, the vocabulary, right? Not just to say like this is what we're going to impose, but to your point, like we don't want to wake up one day and be like, oh crap, like it's too late to regulate this, right? And so I really like, I mentioned it just in passing in my talk, but we just had Suresh Venkatasubramaniam, who is at Brown University, and one of the folks that did the sort of Biden AI blueprint of something, not Bill of Rights, I think that's something else, but maybe James knows what it is. Yeah, anyway, it's not important. But the thing that's important in that is he has this idea of building sensors, not solutions, right? And what I love that because I was like that, yes, right? Like the point of a sensor, and he has this like really beautiful example of like in a nuclear power plant, right? Like they've got 1 million sensors, and similarly in like cockpits, right? Like millions of sensors, because the point is that you want to be getting tons and tons of feedback about the situation rather than having lots of things firing off telling you what to do, right? And so similarly, I see, you know, potential quantitative measures of agency as being those sensors that are firing off, being like, whoa, hey, whoa, right? Like, why did that, you know, there was that big famous, like, let's pause AI, you know, progress. All the famous people signed on, and that had no impact, and part of the reason it had no impact was because we didn't know when we were supposed to resume. Right? And if you have sensors, maybe the sensors tell you, well, pause for now, and then, you know, when stuff is in a better place, you know when to resume. Right? And these are all the sorts of things you can do if you have measures.
I'm going to say something about the importance of having powerful users in this loop. So there are some users who you can just take their jobs. But it's really nice to work with people in safety critical systems because you can't just take their jobs. Pilots need to be trained, and they need to be trained well, and they say no to AI. There is no AI in the cockpit. All of you are saying, what? No? No, well, they're trying. It's not AI. It's been around for 40 years, and it isn't. It's because it works. They will not. I work with people, I work with pilots, medical, and control rooms. And I have an example from RTE, which is the French energy company. They do the nukes. And during the pandemic, there was this tremendous drop in and change in the energy requirements all across France. And what was really interesting is that up until then, the AI systems, because they have all these people doing this, right? They have professional skilled operators. And then they have an AI system that is kind of the backup and following things, and yes, and it's all coming, you know, we're gonna get there. The pandemic happened, and it's like AI just fell to the floor, unable to deal with it. And the human operators struggled, but they kept that thing going. They kept the entire thing going. And so there's this element that I am really deeply convinced about, is that we need to be able to maintain and enhance human expertise. And we should be treating that as a valued, important thing that we do. And I think that's true for designers as much as for doctors and pilots and people running emergency control rooms. And we learn a lot from them, and we can do better AI, but I also think that it helps to have those people in our loop because they can say no when it doesn't work. And other people, unfortunately, can't.
Yeah, one thing that I find interesting too is like, when you talk to experts, they can tell you very well where AI is falling short. Like, for example, even a 3D image generated in Midjourney that you think is perfect, a 3D specialist will be like, actually the lighting here is not bouncing from this wall in this way. And you're like, oh my God, that's incredible, right? But the regular person can't tell that. And the funny thing is, when you talk to a lot of these artists, they'll tell you things like, oh, you know, I wish AI stayed away from the things that I do, but if they can do social media marketing for me, or if they can do my business plan, or if they can do my... So they're basically asking you, can you automate someone else's job, but not mine, right? Which I find really funny. And so it's this kind of thing where, like, if you have all these sensors looking at agency and trying to, like, protect people, you're also, like, always going to fall into other boundaries as well. So, yeah.
It's a great opening for the continued discussion. I think we had a wonderful session. Thanks for all the engaging questions and the 2 fantastic talks.
Can I just thank Alex and Mira for organizing this? They were amazing. They got us talking to each other and really thinking about this, and I really appreciate what you guys did. So thank you.
Thank you.